Moving in to the Philadelphia Eagles. Our narrative for them is, are the Eagles back to being real Super Bowl contenders? Obviously, they go to the Super Bowl, they don't win, they come back next year. They were winning a lot, but it felt a lot like that year the Steelers were like undefeated, and we're like, well, the Steelers really aren't, they're not that good. Like, everyone could see it, but the record wasn't showing it. But there's some people that say you are what your record is. They trade for Kenny Pickett as a backup. They sign Saquon Barkley. They extend A.J. Brown. They extend Devonta Smith. They bring in Mekhi Becton. They extend Landon Dickerson. They bring in Bryce Huff. They kind of overhaul that linebacker room, signing Devin White. Hopefully he can, revamp his career, and then extend Jake Elliott and C.J. Gardner-Johnson. So overall, I think they had a really good free agency. I think the Eagles had probably one of the best off seasons in the NFL. Surprise, surprise.
Yeah, well, I was just going to say, what I really want to say to Eagles fans is, and I mean this truly, truly mean this. Look, I know you remember this too, Hunter. I remember a couple off seasons ago, there were truly Eagles fans that were very on the train of, hashtag fire Howie Roseman, right? I remember that was a thing. Right, Howie Roseman's the reason that this team isn't a championship contender anymore. We need a new GM. I remember this vividly. I know I'm not tweaking around on this one, but it's funny because truly you can see, and there's not a shadow of a doubt about it at this point. Howie Roseman cares far and away about winning and building a championship roster for his organization more than any other GM. Right, like Howie Roseman, I think here's why I say this too. I think if Howie was in charge of a lot of other teams, or I mean vice versa, if a lot of other people were in charge of the team as opposed to Howie, you would say to yourself, well, we're coming off the Super Bowl loss, it was really close, and last year was kind of just it was kind of a blunder. We'll make a couple moves and we'll be fine. We'll be right back to where we were. And you got guys like Howie Roseman that were like, oh, okay, we didn't get the job done, and we had a good year, but it was really because if we're not first, we're last. Fuck that, dude. We're scrapping down again. We're retooling again, and we're getting way better than we already were. Like, not a lot of GMs have the balls, have the confidence to pull that off. And Howie Roseman has been doing it consistently for the Eagles. If you're an Eagles fan, you got to be kissing at the feet of Howie Roseman at this point because the rosters that he keeps putting together for you guys are world-class championship rosters, and he's doing it by wheeling and dealing. It's not like he's just having good players fall into his lap. He's making all the right moves, and he very clearly, deeply cares about the Philadelphia Eagles. More than anything, Eagles fans, you guys have the best GM in the league because he is working his ass off for you guys. I mean, that's really the bottom line about the Eagles after this year. Howie Roseman is getting his hands dirty for this team constantly.
Well, I think, Dobbs, the funniest thing is we always talk about it. It's like sometimes these GMs, like, they just overthink it, right? Like, it's just one of these, like, dude, just make the easy decision. Like, make the choice that everyone knows that you should make. There's a reason when people are like, oh, this should happen, and then rumors start, and then it actually gets done. It's because it's one of those things where it's just like, yeah, this should probably just happen. It works for everybody. Howie Roseman is one of those GMs where he just goes, oh, this will work. This will make us better. Like, this works. This works. A.J. Brown extension, Devonta Smith extension, signing Saquon Barkley. He said the pendulum on how cheap running backs are has swung too far. It's time to get one of the best running backs in the league. And now the run game is going to be great. I think, not that it wasn't last year.
As if it already wasn't. I was saying it was
right. And then you go get Kellen Moore. You go get Vic Fangio. My only question really on this team, before we get to the draft, what does Nick Sirianni necessarily do for them if they don't make a deep run? Like, if you look at this team and go, what does Nick Sirianni do? Because you have an offensive coordinator, you have a defensive coordinator, and both those guys are completely capable of calling the offense and defense. Are you just a culture guy?
No, and I'm glad you brought this up, Hunter, because I actually been talking to a homie recently that is an Eagles fan, and I wanted to get, his interpretation of, like, what is your opinion on the whole Nick Sirianni situation, right? And he said, honestly, what I didn't expect him to say, but he was kind of in agreement with us, but also while being in disagreement at the same time that makes sense. Where he was saying like, look, I think realistically, if you're asking me like from an X's and O's perspective, right, like what Sirianni's doing for the team, realistically, he's really not doing a lot for us. Like as far as an X's and O's coach, they could find so many better options. They really could. But the big thing on top of that is we're kind of in an era now, Dan Campbell being the biggest right example of it, is that you don't always need to have an X's and O's genius to have a good team. You just have to have a guy who can get the guys going to be the head coach, which is exactly what Nick Sirianni is. But if he stops getting those guys going and they're not that same fiery Eagles team, he was saying he has no problem with Sirianni being let out the door because we're at a point where we can see very clearly that this team was at its peak off of the coordinators, right? And now this year with the new coordinators, it was nothing like it was before. So if anything, Jonathan Gannon and Shane Steichen were very clearly, and as I'm very guilty of, I underrated the shit out of them, right? I very much didn't give them the value that they deserve. So all of a sudden, if it's another year of the same thing as last year, I think the Eagles, and like I said, right, Howie Roseman's not here to bullshit, Hunter. If Nick Sirianni pulls the same shit this year, I don't think Howie Roseman has any problem saying, look, I move quickly, right? This league moves quickly. My job was under fire a couple of years ago because of motherfuckers like you. I'm not making the same mistake again. I'm making sure that I bring the right coach in. I'm making sure I read to everything I have to. Because I think if there's one one GM that's not going to play with their coach, the one who already fired the Super Bowl winning coach, it's going to be Howie Roseman. So there's a lot of pressure on Nick Sirianni's shoulders this year to not only get them back to the Super Bowl, but to really get the job done, because this roster, the Lions roster, the Niners roster, they're basically all three the same in terms of quality, right? If you can't get us over the hump this year with what I've put in front of you, speaking from the perspective of Roseman, then we got to ask some questions, right?
Well, I think just quickly to touch on the draft, because we kind of overlooked it a little bit. You know, they had some issues in the secondary. They go get Quinyon Mitchell. They go get Cooper DeJean. And then they bring in two receivers, and Anaya Smith and Johnny Wilson, who could contribute, and even Will Shipley at running back. So it is very, very interesting to think about what the Eagles can be at their height, because as long as Cam Jurgens can be 75% of Jason Kelce, their O-line's not going to really miss a beat, in my opinion. So the Eagles, I think, are back to being real Super Bowl contenders. Last year was kind of a little bit rough, in my opinion.
No, absolutely. Absolutely. Truly, at this point, the bottom line is like the most pressure of anyone on this team far and away is Nick Sirianni.